My name's Andrew War. I'm the head of research at Instagram. Today, however, I will not be talking to you about how to task squish between a selfie face and a duck face, but rather I'll be talking to you about some work I did at Google with my co-authors Chi, Helen Harris, Alexander Kusher, Jen Chen, Robert Flack, and Nicholas Jibkoff. So the topic of my talk is about switching between windows on a desktop. Now you may be thinking, Andy, that's pretty old school. Wasn't that a hot topic in the 70s, 80s, maybe the early 90s? And you would be right. In 1973, we had Alan Kay's seminal work on the Xerox Alto, which was followed later by the Xerox Star in 1981, which of course influenced the interface of the Apple Lisa in 1983 and subsequently the Macintosh in 1984, which in turn inspired Windows 1.0. Now, while I let you gaze upon this beautiful image for a little longer, there was also a lot of research at the time that was looking at tiled and overlapping windows on desktop, and then also interfaces that allowed you to switch or view the windows that you had open on the desktop and switch between them. And that actually happened over the 80s and 90s, and we had a lot of work from Mary and her colleagues at MSR to thank for that, which influenced the interfaces that we use today. Now, let me fast forward you to 2011. If anyone knows what this is, it is the first Chromebook released by Google, the CR48. The purpose, Google's mission here was to release a desktop, or desktop computer, or laptop in this case, that was fast, simple, more secure for a modern age of computing. This was a great opportunity for us. It was a chance to reinvent the desktop experience, start from scratch, design desktop computing the way that we thought it should be for the modern age. So around the same time as this, we actually were designing Chrome for Mobile, which we released in 2012. One of the innovations of this browser was the tab switching interface, where each tab would stack like a vertical stack of cards that you could scroll through and then select the tab that you wished to switch to, which would then come to the forefront. Ed and I actually published a paper at CHI 2013 that compared the tab switching interface that we developed with that of Safari, which was a commonly used tab switching interface at the time. And what we found was that our interface was more efficient, it was less frustrating, and there was no significant difference in the number of error rates. In fact, it was so good that even Apple adopted it. Now, based on this research and the thought that we have Chrome on desktop, or this Chromebook, we have it on mobile, and potentially other computing devices, wouldn't it be great if we had this consistent switching interface across all of these devices? The idea that it might be beneficial to the end user. However, any of you that remember the Pocket PC around 2000 will know that taking an interface from one form factor and trying to put it on another doesn't necessarily work. So we went back to the drawing board. We reviewed a bunch of the literature on window switching, and you can find an overview of this in the notes. I won't cover it here. We did a bunch of whiteboarding sessions to ideate on what we could potentially do. We filed a few patents along the way. And with this in mind, we narrowed this down to some interfaces that we wish to consider for the Chrome OS operating system. The first interface that we was going to consider was this cards interface, which was on the table as a potential to use. So you had each window which was shown in a stack of cards. These could be scrolled through, and the user could select the window that they wish to switch to. There was something based on an old version of Mac's Exposé window switcher, which would spread out the windows based on their relative size and position. Once again, they can see an overview of the available windows and select the one that they wish to switch to. And then there was another idea, which was this idea of, it's inspired by a paper by Tag. I forget the rest of the authors now, but they were doing some interesting work on spatially consistent interfaces. So we designed this, what we called the Mosaic interface, which created a consistent grid which the windows would just be placed into based on recency. So I'm not going to talk too much about the procedure, but basically what would happen is the user would have they'll be at their desktop and they'll have all their windows open, and there was a black taskbar at the bottom, and it would say something like switch to the sticky note window, in which case the user would press a key on the keyboard, which is a dedicated key for switching into the window switching interface, which we have on Chromebooks. They would enter one of these interfaces, and from this point of switching the button, we would start timing, and then they would click on the window to switch to. And at this point, we would measure the time to a successful selection, or any erroneous selections in terms of missing the window or clicking on the wrong window. Our independent variables, so we did a 3x3 mixed factorial design. So of course, the between factors variable that we have here is the window switching interface, where we have the cards, the Exposé, and the Mosaic. The within factors independent variable was the number of windows that we presented. We chose 3, 6, and 9. Our rationale for this was there was actually some research by Hutchings et al. At Microsoft, which found that 80% of the time people had 8 or more windows open on their UI. This was a relatively small sample study and was done internally to a company. We actually went back to our log data and we found that 90% of the time people have 9 or less windows open. Hence the rationale for our distribution of windows that we looked at here. As I mentioned or alluded to previously, the dependent variables were the selection time and then also the number of erroneous selections. Now, what we hypothesized was that the Mosaic interface would actually allow for faster window switching than the cards and the Exposé. The reason for this is the cards interface would require scrolling. So the more windows that you would have, you might have to scroll further to switch to a particular window. And with the Exposé interface, as it was based on relatively size and position, the structure of the window switching interface would not be consistent, which we thought could lead to some confusion there. Similarly, with erroneous selections, we believe that the Mosaic interface would result in less erroneous selections because it was more structurally consistent. Yes. So I'm not going to provide you with a wall of numbers. There is a detailed statistical analysis in the paper if you wish to refer to it. But what we're seeing here is we are seeing the total selection time. So across all the trials that someone did, we have the total selection time, we have the number, we have the switching interfaces that we have, the cards, the Exposé, and the Mosaic, and then we have the number of windows that they were switching between. We found that the Exposé and the Mosaic interfaces were significantly faster than the cards interface, and we found that as the number of windows increased, so did the difference between these interfaces. Although across all conditions for the number of windows, there was no significant difference between the Exposé and the Mosaic interface. So why is this? Well, as I mentioned before, you would have to scroll in the cards interface to actually switch to a window. So the more windows that you have, potentially the more scrolling that you have to do. Furthermore, we actually noticed that in the 3-window condition, there was a marginal significant difference with one of the against one of the interfaces here. And the reason for this is when we went back to the videos, people didn't have to scroll in the 3-window condition because all windows were present at one time. Therefore, someone could just click on the window that they wish to switch to. However, within the cards interface, windows are only, apart from the forefrontmost window, the other windows are only partially visible, which means there is a smaller selection area, which could have impeded the selection time. So we're head-to-head now with the Mosaic and the Exposé. But when we actually look at the number of erroneous selections, we see that when we hit the larger number of windows, the Exposé interface sees a significantly higher error rate than that of the cards and the Mosaic interface. The reason for that, this is quite simple. Considering that the Exposé interface is based on relative size and position, the more windows that you have, the windows become smaller within the switching interface. However, with the cards in the Exposé, you have a constant window thumbnail size. So the thing that we'd have to note here is that we have the Exposé interface, which we find to be significantly faster than the cards interface. And then in terms of erroneous selections, we have the Mosaic interface, which across our number of windows condition has less error rates than that of the Exposé. So this work, in addition to some other research that we conducted on window switching, actually led to the implementation of the Mosaic interface for Chromebooks back in 2013. And I think that's one of the great things about working in industry. Not only can you get your research published at a conference such as CHI, but your research can influence a product which is used by millions. Yes, Chromebooks are used by millions of people. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even over 1 billion people around the world. Thank you.